It started like any other warm Texas evening, the kind that hums with life. The air shimmered above cracked asphalt, the scent of sun-baked earth hung heavy, and the sky stretched wide and calm across the hill country. Neighbors watered lawns, kids tossed footballs across driveways, and cicadas buzzed in the trees. Everything felt familiar, safe, predictable. But somewhere high above that calm, something began to shift. The light dimmed. The wind changed direction. Birds fell silent and vanished into the horizon. A low rumble rolled across the plains, not thunder yet, but something deeper, heavier, like the sky taking a breath. Then came the first strike, a single crack of ice against metal, and another, and another. Within seconds, the heavens opened, unleashing a storm of solid ice. Hailstones the size of baseballs plummeted from the clouds, smashing through roofs, shattering car windshields, and tearing branches from trees. The sound was deafening, a metallic roar that swallowed every other noise. In less than 15 minutes, entire neighborhoods were unrecognizable, buried beneath a sea of white. What had begun as an ordinary spring evening had turned into one of the most violent hailstorms in Texas history, a night when the sky itself seemed to fall. The day had started with the kind of heat Texans know by heart, thick, steady, and relentless. Temperatures climbed into the low 90s, the sky a deep, cloudless blue that shimmered above fields of tall grass and cracked soil. Across central Texas, the air carried the sound of normal life, dogs barking behind fences, sprinklers hissing across front lawns, distant country music drifting from open garages. In Kerrville, families grilled dinner under fading sunlight. Kids raced bikes down quiet cul-de-sacs, and the smell of barbecue smoke lingered in the still air. It was the kind of ordinary evening that made it easy to forget how quickly things can change here, how fast the skies over Texas can turn. But change was already in motion, invisible, silent, and gathering strength miles above the ground. High in the atmosphere, a cold front was pushing south from the plains, colliding with a heavy wall of Gulf moisture rising from the coast. No one could see it yet, but the balance was shifting. The pressure dropped. The wind grew restless. And somewhere in that vast empty sky, the first signs of something violent began to form. Down below, the world still looked calm, too calm. The air hung thick and unmoving, the kind of silence that feels alive, like the earth itself is waiting. Every sound seemed to fade, the hum of cicadas, the rustle of trees, even the faint highway noise beyond town. In Texas, old-timers have a name for that kind of silence. They call it the pause before the sky breaks. By early evening, the horizon over Kerrville had turned the color of bruised metal. The wind that had gone still suddenly roared back to life, whipping through oak trees and rattling screen doors. And then, without warning, the storm struck. The first impacts were scattered faint taps against roofs and car hoods. Then the sky opened and chaos followed. Hailstones the size of baseballs crashed down at nearly 90 miles per hour, hammering the city with a sound that could only be described as war. Roofs split open. Windows exploded inward. Streetlights flickered and went dark as transformers burst in blue flashes. The storm didn't just fall, it attacked. Drivers along Highway 16 slammed on their brakes as the storm turned the world outside into a blur of white. Dashcams captured glass-shattering airbags deploying and people crying out as chunks of ice punched through windshields. Neighborhoods vanished beneath inches of solid ice, gutters collapsed, and storm drains overflowed, turning streets into frozen rivers. Within minutes, emergency dispatchers were overwhelmed. More than 1,200 calls poured in as power grids failed across central Texas. Over 15,000 homes went dark. The sound was unbearable, a relentless metallic roar that echoed for miles, vibrating through walls and windows. People huddled in hallways clutching flashlights, praying their roofs would hold. For 20 endless minutes it felt as if the sky itself was breaking apart. And then, as quickly as it began, it stopped. The last hailstone fell rolling to a stop against the curb. The roar faded into silence. When residents finally stepped outside the world they knew was gone, replaced by a landscape of ice, shattered glass, and disbelief. Texas had seen storms before, but not like this. When the storm finally passed, the silence that followed didn't feel peaceful, it felt hollow. The roar of hail was replaced by the faint hiss of melting ice water dripping from torn gutters onto cracked pavement. The first light of dawn revealed what the darkness had hidden: streets buried under inches of ice, cars cratered, and twisted roofs punched through like tin. In every direction, Texas looked frozen in shock. Families stepped outside, barefoot, crunching over white debris that only hours ago had been their roofs and fences. Windows gaped open to the cold air. Trees lay splintered across driveways. It was as if the whole world had stopped and all that remained was the sound of dripping water and disbelief. Emergency crews worked through the night, navigating blocked roads and downed power lines. Firefighters went door to door, checking on families huddled in dark homes. Volunteers handed out blankets, bottled water, and flashlights from pickup trucks. Farmers walked through fields that had been full of green just days before, now flattened, shredded, and gone. Insurance adjusters moved slowly from house to house, their cameras clicking over what once had been ordinary life. But in that wreckage, something familiar began to return the Texas spirit. Neighbors with chainsaws cleared fallen branches. Churches opened their doors to anyone who needed shelter. Local diners gave out free coffee and breakfast to linemen working around the clock. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind everyone that even in destruction, community survives. Because here in Texas, storms may tear through towns, but they never tear apart the people who call it home. In the weeks that followed, Texas began to pick up the pieces. The ice melted, but the scars it left behind ran deep, not just in the streets, but in the hearts of everyone who lived through it. Across the hill country and Brazos Valley, the true cost of the storm came into focus. Damage estimates soared into the hundreds of millions of dollars, stretching insurance companies to their limits. Repair shops overflowed with cars beaten beyond recognition. Roofing crews worked from sunrise to sunset, their hammers echoing across neighborhoods still lined with blue tarps. Farmers faced devastation on a different scale. Fields that once promised a strong harvest of peaches, melons, and tomatoes now lay bare, stripped clean by wind and ice. The loss rippled far beyond the farms themselves, pushing food prices up in grocery stores from Austin to Dallas. For some, it was the second major storm in a year, and for many, it was the breaking point. But the hardest damage to measure wasn't physical. It was the silence that came every time thunder rolled in the distance, the way people stopped what they were doing and looked at the sky. Children woke crying when rain hit the roof. Dogs hid under tables. Adults flinched at the sound of hail against glass. The storm had ended, but for thousands it hadn't truly passed. Yet, through it all, one thing never changed: the stubborn, unshakable resolve that defines Texas. People rebuilt what they could, repaired what was left, and stood by one another when help was needed most. Because here, resilience isn't just a word, it's a way of life. And though the storm had passed, its lesson remained. The next one is already forming on the horizon. In the months after the hailstorm, the numbers told one story, but the people told another. Insurance estimates placed total damages at nearly $500 million, yet no number could capture the exhaustion in families still waiting for repairs. In small towns across the hill, country blue tarps fluttered from rooftops like silent flags of survival. Auto repair shops ran 24-hour shifts just to keep up. Construction crews were booked solid through the summer as supply shortages drove up the price of roofing materials and replacement glass. Everywhere you looked, reminders of that night still lingered: cracked sidewalks, dented siding, broken street signs still hanging by a bolt. For farmers, the storm's reach went far beyond the fields. With crops destroyed and irrigation systems torn apart, many faced the impossible choice between starting over or closing down. Some took out new loans, betting everything on the next season. Others packed up generations of work and walked away. In rural communities, the loss wasn't just financial, it was cultural. Entire towns built around harvest seasons, and local markets found themselves fighting to stay alive. And then came the second wave, the emotional one. Counselors across Central Texas reported spikes in anxiety, especially among children and the elderly. Every time thunder rolled across the sky, the fear returned. People who once stood on porches to watch summer storms now closed their curtains and waited in silence. It wasn't just about the past, it was about what might come next. Yet, amid it all, one thing stood firm: the spirit of Texans who refused to surrender. Communities came together to rebuild schools, restore farms, and prepare for the storms still to come. Nonprofits launched climate awareness programs. Local leaders called for stronger infrastructure and better preparedness. The message was clear: this wasn't just recovery, it was reckoning. Because the storm may have passed, but the warning it carried is still echoing across the state. And somewhere in that same Texas sky, new clouds are already forming. As the weeks turned into months, the memory of the Texas hailstorm began to fade from the headlines, but not from the people who lived through it. The ice melted, the roads were cleared, and the sunlight returned, but the sound of that night, the roar of hail pounding roofs and glass, stayed etched in memory. For many, it became more than a weather story. It was a reminder of how fragile safety can be, of how quickly the ordinary can become chaos. Still, even in that truth, there was hope. Because what this storm revealed wasn't just destruction, it was humanity at its strongest. Neighbors who shared generators, firefighters who worked through the night, strangers who became family in the face of disaster. That spirit, that stubborn, unbreakable resilience is what keeps Texas standing. So, if this story moved you, if it made you stop and think about how fragile life can be when the sky turns against us, don't let it end here. Like this video to help it reach more people. Share it with someone who needs to see what's really happening. Subscribe for more true stories that reveal the power of nature and the courage of those who face it. And now, we want to hear from you. Do you believe storms like this are unstoppable forces of nature or the result of a changing climate we've helped create? Are we truly ready for what's next, or are we still hoping it will never reach us? Tell us what you think in the comments below. Because awareness, your voice, your story, your action is where change begins.